Karim Bardeesy here from the Ryerson Leadership Lab, and I'm joined by Sean Mullan of the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And welcome to this webinar session focused on the Government of Canada's economic package announced both Friday and today, and some of the issues involved. Again, my name is Karim Bardeesy. I'm from the Ryerson Leadership Lab. This is the first time we're running a kind of a pop-up video webinar of this fashion. There may be a few glitches along the way, but we hope that you stay patient and stay with us as we experiment with this format and connect with a community of people that's really hungry for information and also hungry for some context of how these issues work. Si vous voulez poser votre question en français, allez-y sur le groupe Slido qui va être créé sur le chat et je vais répondre et traduire. If you'd like to ask in French, we will be able to, I will translate the question and give a reply in both French and English. The Ryerson Leadership Lab is a action-oriented think tank based at Ryerson University. We work at the intersection of leadership and public policy, trying to develop new leadership at all ages and stages to tackle some of our most pressing public challenges. And at a time like this is a public challenge that has not just any public institution, but really any institution in society, as well as all of us individually facing a challenge. And so we felt as an action-oriented think tank that we had a responsibility to respond. Sean and I co-wrote an op-ed that was in the Toronto Star yesterday with some advice to government. And we thought that it was important to talk to the community about some of the ideas in that op-ed, as well as give some context and explanation of what the federal government is up to. And more generally, create some opportunity for people to be informed. There's lots of expertise on this call. Some folks who are in our community know a lot more about some of the issues than Sean or I would, and we hope we can work with this community to help provide useful and actionable information to you, and hopefully tap some of that expertise in future offerings like this. So again, thank you for joining us. We'll be on the call for about an hour, about 25 minutes of me and Sean speaking, followed by a Q&A section through Slido. And so now I'll introduce Sean Mullan from the Brookfield Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship to talk a bit about himself. Then we'll go to Famida Kamali from the Ryerson Leadership Lab, who will explain the rules of procedure for the next little bit.
Great. Thank you, Karim. Pleasure to join the Ryerson Leadership Lab here as a guest on their webinar on this important topic. The Brookfield Institute, just for those of you who don't know about our background, we're a public policy and economic policy focused think tank. We look at the questions that kind of surround Canada's future as it relates to the innovation economy. And we're proudly housed here at Ryerson University with the Ryerson Leadership Lab, one of our colleagues. My background, I'm an economist. I've spent a bunch of time in public policy, thinking about questions of economic policy. I don't tend to spend a lot of time on my biography, but one piece that is relevant, I think, for today and is helping to inform at least the op-ed we put together was I was the senior advisor to the Premier for economic and fiscal policy back in 2008 and 2009. So when we were going through the Great Recession, and we'll talk a little bit later, I think, today about what's the same and what's very different from that crisis, but that's certainly the, I think, most recent and most relevant touch point in terms of the economic crisis we're dealing with in recent history. So with that, I think I'll just pass it over to Famida to do some housekeeping.
Hi, everyone. There are over 200 people who have signed up for this webinar. So just to keep things under control, we have automatically muted everyone, but you do have the option to turn on your video if you want to see who else has joined. To interact with Karim and Sean, please use Slido. I've put the information for Slido in chat, but you go to www.sli.do and enter the event code RLL1. That's in all caps, RLL1. You can submit questions online and upvote other questions that are of interest to you. The questions with the most votes will be answered by Sean and Karim first. What I'll do is I will monitor the questions. You can feel free to put in questions as they are doing their talk. I'll be monitoring the Slido, and then I will read out the questions to them. If you choose to identify yourself, we will shout out the person who has asked the question. If not, you can ask questions anonymously. We ask that you also engage in the poll offered on Slido, letting us know which sector you come from. So we want to know if you're a student or if you work in the not-for-profit sector, the private sector, broader public sector, in a union or in government, or if you're an academic. So we will be here on the chat. There are members of the Ryerson Leadership Lab team here to answer any questions you have. But yeah, I think we can begin with Sean and Karim's talk.
Great. Thank you, Famita. And yes, please go ahead to use that chat function within Zoom for any kind of technical questions, and use the Slido link to pose the content-related questions. So perhaps a bit of an overview of what's happening, and obviously this is a very fluid situation. Also wanted to just recognize, and in a situation like this, I think the best thing we can do is just simply recognize the difficulty that people are experiencing right now, primarily on the health side, but potentially on the economic side as well. I know a number of us would already have friends or family members or colleagues who are suffering economically as a result of this, or are in situations where our own economic situation is going to be challenged, or is already starting to get challenged because of this situation. I think it's important to note that this is primarily this started as a health system crisis and a health system situation, and this webinar is not about that primarily. Both Sean and I did work at the provincial level, and I have some experience on health files, but had never encountered a health crisis of this nature, health system crisis of this nature. But we can speak a bit to that I can speak a bit of that to the Q&A, although that's not the main focus of this. You can tell a bit about that this was primarily a health system crisis by the responses that you were getting from governments internationally and organizations like the World Health Organization that eventually resulted in responses at the Canadian level around travel advisories and health system precautionary measures. And in fact, the original investments by governments in response to this crisis were health system related. As it became clear that this was a broader issue that was going to potentially involve a key intervention that we just haven't seen on such a large scale before, i.e. social distancing and all the things that can't happen economically as a result of social distancing. That's really where you saw the shift to the economic policy side and economic measures that might need to be used to respond to the crisis. This, as Armenia Alnesian had mentioned on TVO's The Agenda for the earlier this week, this is proving to be a recession driven by an economic crisis driven by services, because it's those service provision pieces that are so fundamentally driven by the social distancing required and the need for people to not be in groups together. That really creates a hit on the services sector as much as the goods sector. And so we're seeing the proportion of that being so great in many Western economies, really driving some of the original activity. So you saw primarily governments responding from a health system perspective, I would say from the conversations I was in, by about 3 to 4 weeks ago, there was some real concern that this was going to hit the economy. And you started having governments responding. Many governments do most governments do a late winter or early spring budget. So they would have been preparing for all the things that they would do in terms of their budget. And in the recent weeks, they had to do quite a sharp pivot. And you're seeing now the federal government responding with two interventions on the Friday focused on the financial system, and now today focused on people and small businesses. And I think you'll expect to see both other levels of government coming in with more, and with the federal government has itself stated pretty explicitly that this will not be the first intervention that they're going to make. So that's a bit of the setup around the context of how an issue like this comes to the attention of policymakers. As you can tell, it came very fast and not that much faster for them than for us. This was catching a lot of people by surprise. And governments do have contingency plans for various forms of economic situations, but I think this one, like with any institution, is unlike anything we've ever seen. So with that, I'll pass over to Sean, and Sean will give you a bit of a framework of how we think that governments in particular need to think about this issue. And some of this has been informed by some good work by Kevin Milligan, Sean Spear, and others who have been writing about this online.
Thank you, Karim. Yes, and I should emphasize, although I think we're proud of the argument we put out and put into the op-ed yesterday. It is really, I think, an emerging consensus now amongst economists and policymakers that the need for a fiscal response and fiscal stimulus is very different under this global health crisis than it would be under previous recessions. So today, a very substantial package was announced by the federal government. Before I think we can unpack that, we need to kind of explain, at least from our perspective, why this time is different, and what are the particular challenges of thinking about economic policy and economic stimulus when our first and foremost priority should be containing the health crisis. And so that ultimately leads us to propose kind of a three-phased approach for response under this type of environment, and to distinguish each one of these phases from what we would normally think of as just a catch-all stimulus response in light of a typical economic downturn. So the first thing we need to keep in mind is, traditionally, economic stimulus is about incenting people and actors and workers and firms to go out and participate in the economy, to go out and buy things, to take trips, to go out for at a restaurant, to accelerate infrastructure spending, to renovate your house. All these traditional economic activities that a normal stimulus would be connected to are things we don't want to do right now. In fact, they would be counterproductive. We want people to stay at home, stay in their houses, social distancing, in order to contain the primary threat, which is, of course, the health crisis. And so that's why I think the contours of what we see today, and why the strategy that needs to be put in place to combat this economic crisis is very different from the past. So first phase, we need to essentially build a bridge to ensure that Canadian workers and Canadian businesses don't go bankrupt, that they have literally the cash in their bank accounts and cash in their wallets in order to bridge through the next, what's probably looking to be the next 2 to 3 months, until we can get to the other side, where the number of cases is declining, where we've confidently contained this pandemic. And only then can we start to employ what are considered to be much more traditional tools of economic stimulus, where, say, a temporary GST cut, accelerating infrastructure spending, things like in 2008, 2009, there's a home renovation tax credit. Those things may be and probably should be considered as part of a phase 2, when we can turn from focusing on health to focusing on truly stimulating the economy. There will be almost certainly some natural demand coming back when everyone is released from their homes and is allowed to go out and buy things. There will certainly be some pent-up demand, but we'll need to be helping businesses and workers that will need support kickstarting that demand across the economy. And so phase 2 in our mind, is a much more traditional package of economic stimulus, of which you didn't see many of those things today, and probably for a very good reason. And phase three to us is sometime in the summer, in the fall, if things go well. We'll be turning the corner. The economy will be coming back. The thoughts of this pandemic will be receding, but parts and sectors of this economy will be fundamentally changed. And there's questions that we just don't know the answer to. How globally connected will we allow our economy to be, given how easy it is to transmit a virus like this? Will a shift to working from home occur across the economy? If even 5% of the workforce shifted permanently to working from home relative to today, that would be a massive shift in terms of how we work, and have impact on everything from commuting to transportation systems. And finally, which sectors of the economy are going to be winners and losers? I think everyone kind of jokes about the stock price of Zoom, which we're literally on today, has gone up in this environment. That's an obvious case, but what other parts of the economy are going to be coming out ahead? Who's going to be coming out behind? Which workers, which segments of the economy will need long-term support in addition to just short-term bridging support? And so I think conceptually, if we break our thinking, and governments break their thinking up into these three phases: number one, bridge the economy while we fight the virus; number two, bring back the economy now that the virus is contained; and number three, what is the new normal, and how does the economy function post-pandemic? And it'll help us as a framework to understand what's going on and make better decisions.
And let me just add one thing, because this situation is so fluid, with some of the expert epidemiological opinions now starting to converge that first phase might have to be longer than people anticipated. We'll have to watch to see how the federal government reacts to that. And so now we'll just, Sean will just give a quick overview. I think we're going to post in the Slack channel, or sorry, in the chat channel, the link to the government release that has all the measures that were announced by the Prime Minister and Minister Morneau and the Bank of Canada Governor Poloz. So Sean's just going to walk through some of the key features of the package, and then we'll go to a bit of a wrap up and then questions and answers.
Great. The one thing I should point out, although we are focusing today on the federal response, what was announced earlier today, and it makes sense, I think, for the federal government to take a lead on this. We shouldn't lose sight of that there's lots of room and things happening at the provincial level, and you hear things being announced province to province, and governments at those levels are, I know, doing their best to try and respond as well. So when we think about the totality of Canada's response, even though today we're going to be focusing mainly on the federal government a set of policies, please keep in mind and keep an eye on what's happening at the provincial level. In many parts of the economy, the provinces end up being more substantial or have a bigger responsibility, and so this is an area where there definitely needs to be a concerted effort. And I think what we're seeing from our leaders right now is rising up and putting differences aside, and they're really working across party lines and across different levels of government quite effectively. And so I would just only encourage that type of activity right now.
Yeah.
So today I'm not going to go into a super detailed listing of what happened today. You can find that in the link. The materials provided by the Department of Finance are quite comprehensive and helpful. What I'm going to try and do is kind of break them down into categories, and kind of, in my mind, they do nicely line up with a phase one, which is about providing funding to individuals and businesses to help bridge through this section of the or this phase of the response. So it's neatly broken down into support for individuals and support for businesses. Under the individual support for Canadians, individual Canadians, they've broken their set of policies into a number of different categories. The first is simply support for people who, income support for people who need to stay home and aren't getting paid to do so. So a lot of people have the benefit of having a salary and can take a sick day or can just work from home. Not every Canadian can do that. And so what they're doing is they're expanding eligibility for EI and providing support for those through what's called an emergency care benefit for those who don't qualify for EI. The EI rules in Canada are notoriously complicated. And so what they're effectively doing is cutting through that and saying, if you don't fit into EI, we're going to create a parallel benefit so that you can benefit equally. They're providing up to $900 a month for up to 15 weeks for people who are being forced to stay at home and cannot get paid during that period, or they're self-employed. In addition to that, they're providing long-term income support for workers, longer-term income support. They provided $5 billion for those facing unemployment. So this is not that you're being forced to stay at home and you can't work. It's that you've actually lost your job, and EI is also not kicking in to a sufficient extent. So both of these, I think, are very consistent with how do we get money into the pockets of workers who are going through some of the toughest times right now, or some of the most vulnerable workers. In addition to that, they are doing a much more broad-based income transfer. So again, funding to low and modest income families through existing mechanisms. And you'll see this as a pattern. They're doing it through what's called the GST credits, and they're doing this through what they call the Canadian Child Benefit. These are two existing programs that provide support to low and medium income Canadians. The CCB, of course, is based on how many children you have. And what they're doing is effectively figuring out what is the fastest way we can get money into the pockets of Canadians. These programs exist already. If you're already eligible, you're already signed up. You probably, more than 90% of Canadians are set up for direct deposit under these programs. And so rather than going through the mechanisms of creating a new program and say cutting checks to 18 or 35 million Canadians, they are using the systems that are already in place to send money out as quickly as possible. The benefit under these, they're estimating somewhere to close to $400 for single individuals and $600 for couples under the GST. And for the CCB, they're looking at a one-time $300 increase per child. And these would hit people's bank accounts sometime between April and May. So again, money in people's pockets to support them, and specifically targeted to the most vulnerable and those who need it the most. There are a number of other more specially designed programs here. There's support for, there's a 6-month interest-free moratorium on student loans. There's a $305 million fund for Indigenous community support. There's $157 million to help homeless, the support and infrastructure for homeless people who may not even have, who obviously don't have a place necessarily to go for social distancing. And there's a little bit of relief for seniors under what they have to withdraw under their retirement savings funds. Expect to see more programs here. I don't have any inside information, but I think what you're seeing here is what has been put together to date. And as they are responding and need to find more targeted areas of the population that are not being addressed by these, I think you'd expect to see the government responding. There's a lot about deferring taxes for individuals and businesses. That's an easy thing for the government to do. I think it will help some people, but the vast majority of people don't end up having to pay taxes at the end of the year, and it's limited in how much relief that provides. So I think this is a nice to do, but I wouldn't overly fixate on that as being a huge contributor to everyone across the board. On the businesses side, I won't go into a ton of detail here. The one thing I would say that is particularly relevant and worth looking at is what they're calling wage subsidies for employers, with the idea of, can they provide money to small and medium-sized businesses who might be faced with this difficult decision of, I'm either going to go out of business, or I need to cut employees off my payroll. And so almost certainly layoffs are going to happen. I'm sure they've already started. But what the government has announced here today is a subsidy of up to 10% of payrolls for small and medium-sized businesses for a 3-month period, as a means of providing an incentive to keep people employed. That won't cover, that won't cover obviously all the costs, and we'll have to see if that amount makes sense. But in terms of kind of a first step in this area, I think it's a positive step. It's also something that can happen immediately as well, because what they've said is, rather than applying for this, just simply take this money off of the payroll that you have to, the income tax remittances that you have to provide the government monthly anyways. And so effectively, it's allowing small, medium-sized businesses to keep more of this money in their bank accounts and not having to send it to the government in the first place. I'm going to stop there. If there's questions about some of the more technical things being put in place, the financing lines, the Canada account, or any kind of sector-specific support for businesses, I'm happy to address those in the Q's and A's. But I think we kind of covered the main pieces in terms of income support and funding to small, medium-sized businesses to help them weather the storm.
Yeah. So this package is primarily about getting money to people. As any of you would know who are encountering some tougher circumstances today than last week, we also know that there's a dealing with cost side of people's personal financial equations, which wasn't dealt with a ton in this package. You got the interest deferral on the Canada student loans. You got some tax system deferral, but we know that that's a really important source of stress for a lot of people right now. Again, I do want to point out that someone by the name of John Shell, I don't know if it's actually John Shell or someone who is pretending to be John Shell, but John Shell from Social Capital Partners, who's doing his own conference call with The Logic tomorrow, has written an important piece that in many ways complements the piece that we wrote, that points to all the places in which there's a need for some measures, and not just by governments, but by institutions, to help people reduce the costs that they would otherwise have to face. So that really important policy measure, something that the federal government has some role in, provinces have some role in, but sometimes through their regulatory and other powers, not necessarily through sending cash for those things. Just we wanted to, that's the sum up of this part of the conversation. We'll go to the Q&A. Some of the issues we'll want to address in the Q&A, what's missing in this package, who's being left behind, what role should provinces and other institutions, non-government institutions, play in this, where is more support needed, how does this fit also in the context of the overall economy. In general, consumer spending is around 60 to 70% of typical GDP. And we're really going to see a significant reduction of that. This package on the active spending side is estimated to be around 3% of GDP. But it's definitely possible that we'll need to see more. And you saw the government again indicating that there was probably going to be more down the road. And we can also comment incidentally on some of the other kind of policy issues and political considerations that go into a package like this. Also wanted to say thank you to Andrew Phillips of the Toronto Star for taking our op-ed, which helped catalyze this call. With that, I think we'll go to the Slido. And Famita, if you want to just tell us, do you have anything else to add, or we'll go straight to the questions?
So we've had some folks join after we did the introduction. So folks online, we will be using Slido to take questions from the audience. So you can go to www.sli.do and use the event code RLL1. That's in all caps, RLL1. You can submit questions anonymously or use your name. What I'll be doing is I'll be moderating the questions that get the most votes. We will answer those in sequence. Some folks have put in chat some questions. We're going to be transferring those over to Slido. I can also confirm for you, Karim, that it was John Shell and he is on the call.
Yes.
So what we'll do is, and for the Q&A, some folks have suggested that if you would like, you can feel free to turn on your video so you can see others on the call in this time where we're all social distancing. But before we get into Q&A, let's just quickly look at our poll to see how many people shared with us what sector they're working in. So we had 60 people vote. Most people work in the not-for-profit sector. So 38% of folks who have voted work in not-for-profit. We're getting some more votes in, but we do see a lot of people joining us from the private sector. Some folks, a very small amount from government or broader public sector, some academics on the line, no one from any unions, and we also have our student community online.
Great,
so,
let's go going with the first question.
Yes, so the first question, top voted, how did the government land on $27 billion as the amount they would spend?
So maybe Sean, I'll take a crack at this. And typically, again, the way governments would work, both Sean and I both worked in finance and the Premier's office at the provincial level and have some sense of how these situations arise. And it's really about estimates of what kind of money is needed in the economy. Again, as Sean noted, this is not a consultant. This is not then to be spent. It is then to be there to support people's incomes. So in general, there's some modeling that takes place around something like that. There's also, I think it's really important to note the thing that Sean mentioned in his overview, using the tools that are best available at the moment to get money to people quickly. You'll see if you go through the press release that some tools are actually available immediately or as immediately as possible through the EI system. Others, which will require the Parliament to come back, should be available in April. And so there's a way in which there's a kind of in a sense, a trade-off between what's the amount of money that's required and what's the best way to get it out. And it's clear to us anyway that they left themselves more room for future spending. The term fiscal firepower has been used a lot by the federal government to indicate that they believe, and there's some evidence, quite a bit of evidence of this, that the strong credit rating of the federal government allows some proportion of spending. I will note that the kinds of numbers we're hearing about in other countries, the proportion of GDP that's going to the initial packages might have the Canadian government look to do more or look for provinces to do more.
I would just add, there's no magic to 27 billion. This is almost certainly put together by what can we do here and there, and the number starts to add up.
Yeah.
To me, it very much looks like a work in progress. Minister Morneau, the Prime Minister, even the Bank Governor all said today they expect more to happen. Stay tuned, it's a work in progress. 27 billion is a little bit more than 1% of GDP. It is a non-trivial amount of money in a short period of time to inject into the economy. And in any other environment, this would be a tremendous intervention.
Yeah.
The US is talking about $800, $900 billion, which proportionally speaking would put us up around an $80, $90 billion stimulus package. So there's probably more room for us to go. And the other thing I would say is a lot of people are just adding up these numbers. There's 27 billion. This might be a question, so I'm just kind of preempting it. They're adding 27 billion to the 55 billion in corporate tax deferrals. And so you heard a lot of reporters say this was about 3% of GDP.
Yeah.
This is apples and oranges.
Yeah.
And I know this is kind of inside baseball, but $27 billion is what's going out into the economy, net new money that's not coming back. It's going into people, not coming back to government. It's going into people's pockets. That is a direct stimulus, providing liquidity, providing loans, completely helpful. Don't get me wrong, they're useful instruments, but but a loan has a much smaller economic impact from a dollar term than a direct grant. So you can't kind of just add these things up together and say this is kind of a 3% of GDP stimulus package.
Yeah, you're going to see in general, I think, a lot of questions about how credit markets are going to start to work in a situation of widespread or wider spread indebtedness. And again, I'll commend some of the other articles and John Schell's article that pointed that out. Okay, next question.
Okay, next question. Where do provincial governments and city governments come in? What can we expect to see from them?
I'll just say they will come in. It sounded like they were in general attending to the health system and waiting for the federal government response. They would have been in close contact with the federal government, and we already heard from Ontario that there is going to be their own version of a response after this. So expect them in general to come in soon after with the ability to borrow as they can. And city governments, many city governments, at least in Ontario, the city governments are not formally allowed to run deficits. And so it'll be interesting to see if any of those powers get amended to allow city governments to take on to run annual deficits. But we expect there's going to be there are going to be calls on the services of city governments. City governments are maybe a little more are generally more dependent on property tax revenue and other levels of government, so they're a bit more insulated from some of these impacts year to year. But the overall pressure on cities and municipalities is going to be huge.
Indeed. Remember, the federal government has the most fiscal capacity at this point in time. It's right for them to take the lead on a economic stimulus response. Provinces should and can play a role. This would be consistent with how it played out in 2008, 2009, where a lot of provinces were able to match or contribute to the federal government's lead. And provinces are closer to some other, like they deliver different services, right? So they deliver social assistance programs, for example. So being mindful to how policy plays out in that environment. Provinces can oftentimes be closer to the economic sectors that are specific to their areas or their regions, and so they need to play leadership roles in that area. And cities, as Karim said, very restricted from a fiscal capacity perspective. I think we need them to play their public health role and to play the role with the infrastructure and services they provide. And we're not really looking to cities to spend drastically more than they can or have planned in the past.
Okay, next question.
Okay, this question is from Nancy Wilson, who's the CEO of Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce. What measures are in place to mitigate the economic issues specific to underrepresented entrepreneurs? Example, women identified. Additional recommendations?
So I'll defer to Sean a bit on this. I did not see anything of that nature. Sometimes when there are programs like this, they can then flow through different streams. So if the Business Development Bank of Canada, if EDC had a stream that was, and I believe they do, are focused on women entrepreneurs, then there's an opportunity there. I did not see that, and that's also an opportunity for potential advocacy. Again, don't underestimate the degree of speed that was required to put out a package like this. I think you saw some particular attention to Indigenous communities and the realities of the Canada Indigenous communities relationship. But that level of specificity that Nancy, you're asking about, was not, from what I could see, addressed, and is probably creates an opportunity for advocacy.
They started broad. I mean, they by necessity started as broad as they could. And I hope they are able to get more and more targeted over the course of this package. And so what I think is realistic is certainly during this stage of the support, creating brand new programs is probably unlikely. They probably just don't have the bandwidth to do that. But if there's existing programs that can be bolstered, if you see like what's going on with the Canadian Child Benefit and can be leveraged and funding can be topped up, then that's what I would be advocating for in terms of the fastest way to get support to particular targeted areas of the economy.
Okay, next question.
Okay, the next question is from Hannah at Maytree. Am I right that eligibility for the GST credit boost is based on income in the 2018 tax year? So not necessarily well targeted at people in serious need right now.
I believe that's correct. And I believe more the government in its announcement actually said that this was a prompt, while they delayed the 2019 tax returns, I believe they urged people to do prompt filings if they were eligible for this credit. So the enhanced credit could be given on up-to-date information.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Another question, where did this money or this budget come from? How will it impact us in the future so we can prepare?
Sean, you want to take this one? It's an important one.
Sorry, repeat that. I was just looking at the wrong comment. I was looking at John Shell's comment here, which is very thankful.
Yeah. This question is around where did this money or this budget come from? How will it impact us in the future so we can prepare?
So, I mean, the technical answer to this is the government of Canada is going to borrow this money.
Yeah.
Interest rates are at, again, at all-time lows, close to the very bottom, almost zero long-term interest rates, as it was in the 2008-2009 recession. So not only is the short-term interest rate very low, the 30-year bond rate was less than 1% last week. That means governments can access capital in ways that businesses or anybody else cannot do, and at such cheap rates. I won't go into why, but that at least is a helping hand. That's a very positive thing for governments in terms of being able to fight the recession.
Yeah.
Canada, at least at the federal level, is in very good fiscal shape. The Financial Budget Office said even before, a month ago, put out a report saying that prior to this financial crisis, obviously they didn't know there was a financial crisis going, but that Canada could either cut taxes or increase spending or a combination of the two by 1.8% of GDP and still have a declining debt to GDP balance, which is really the metric that economists and policymakers use to decide whether a government can afford something. So it means we had a lot of room. It meant we could have increased the deficit by another 40 billion, and we still would have been in fine shape. And that would have been before the crisis. During the crisis, there's even an additional argument for spending, because the fiscal stimulus framework here basically says without support, without stabilizing the economy, economies can get into a kind of circular declines. And essentially, as people lose their jobs, as people lose incomes, they stop buying things, or they stop procuring services. That has a negative impact on businesses and business confidence. And what it ends up doing is causing more job losses. This is what we saw in the Great Depression. This is what we saw in any period of prolonged economic downturn. And so the idea with a fiscal and monetary policy stimulus is to get in there, arrest that vicious cycle, and replace it with a virtuous cycle. And so, although I hesitate to say there's a free lunch, there will be a cost to future in terms of the debt of Canada. This is one of these investments, and at the time in the fiscal cycle where borrowing to first of all shore up the finances of our individuals and our businesses, and then secondly, incenting economic revival will end up paying for itself. Will end up generating economic activity down the road, and arrest the potential for kind of a prolonged Great Depression.
There's one aspect of this which we haven't talked a lot about yet, which is a really important one, which is the international aspect of this. And Sean touches on it a bit. One thing to note is that Canadian, and we'll see how long this lasts, for a variety of reasons, the U.S. dollar is still seen as kind of the currency of last resort in the world economy, and the Canadian dollar has fallen quite a bit against the U.S. dollar in recent days and weeks, which does indicate some loss of purchasing power. That will make our exports cheaper, but doesn't indicate some loss of purchasing power. So there's a flip side to the low interest rate. It makes honoring pension obligations tougher, and it has potential to have an impact on exchange rates. Actual John Shell.
So we've got a question from John Shell. There is very little in the package for local small businesses. The 10% amount is a joke compared to New Zealand and France. Is the issue coordination with provinces? And
maybe let me speak to this briefly, and then Sean. And thanks to Monty and Faizan and Rania, who have we're seeing your video. And if anyone else wants to put their video on, you're more than welcome to do so. That is a small amount of money given the need, given the loss of hours and of income, and will that 10%? One of the really important questions to ask is, what kind of intervention is needed to keep people on the payroll at all? And I suspect that is insufficient. But again, we have to see what other forms of interventions are possible. The federal government and the provincial government, in my opinion, are not the only players in that piece. But I generally agree with John that it is insufficient.
It seems small. It is, I think, almost unprecedented in Canadian history. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's okay. It seems to me like they're dipping their toe in here, and then I think if there's one area that they probably need to rapidly take a look at and see if they're planning to bolster or add or enrich, it probably would be in this area. And it's tough to design a program, right, where this is going to be really costly, and it's going to go to a bunch of businesses that don't need it.
Yeah, and
then it's going to be not enough for a bunch of businesses that desperately need it, and it's always a challenge when you're trying to design these things. But I think on balance, it does seem too low, from my opinion.
And that's why I just wanted to point out the need for other places to intervene in this. I've worked in a government that did a wage subsidy for a youth jobs program. Wage subsidies are not any finance department's preferred option, and so. Again, probably some inside baseball here, but that was probably something that was, my guess is, perhaps pushed by the political side. Wage subsidies have really tough targeting issues and are really hard to deliver. So I would say that there's a public policy need for some of the other players in the system to find ways to support incomes and jobs. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, just being conscious that we've got about 12 minutes left on the schedule for this. We have a question from Ankur Pandit. In the US right now, there are bipartisan discussions around implementing a universal basic income. Should we do the same in Canada, and what does that look like?
So this package isn't that exactly, but there are ways to reimagine the way the pieces were put together. 9 out of 10 Canadians, for instance, qualify for a child benefit. I'm not sure what the GST and HST qualification rates are, but they're quite high as well. So there are things that they've started to put together that creep towards that direction. Sean and I have not yet talked about this. We had a line in the op-ed that we then took out saying, if this takes us closer to a universal basic income, so be it. I think that's a step change in the future economy to the 3-point editorial, 3 points that Sean laid out in our op-ed. You could definitely expect this to really ramp up, really force the discussion in the recovery phase about whether that's something that's needed. I believe there is an argument that we need some sort of temporary version of that, but how you deliver it is a question, and whether it's actually being delivered through some of these other means. It seems like it is being close to being delivered through these other means that the government has at its disposal.
Just looking through these questions, trying to see if there are some other ones. There was a question around, there have been a lot of events and issues in recent months, school strikes, rail blockades, and now COVID. How do policymakers proceed in such unprecedented times?
This is an incredible challenge of leadership in public policy. And I think to Sean's earlier point, we're seeing some of the best of what Canada can do with, we don't have a lot of, we have some consensus around the main issues of public policy to begin with. We don't have nearly the level of division, either public policy division or political rancor that we do in the States. You see different orders of government cooperating, but I think fundamentally people are, political leaders are feeling their way through this, and don't underestimate, incidentally, the inability to do work as normal to contribute to that. The people who are making these decisions are not necessarily in the same rooms as each other anymore. They've got family and situations to attend to. So there's a personal side to this that you can't underestimate. I think a lot of us are going to play the tape back in our heads about what if we'd taken these more aggressive social distancing measures and pressured our governments to do them earlier. And I think it sounds like in general there is now pretty strong political class consensus. I don't yet know if there's public consensus around those things. So that would be the other thing to note, that there was a list of things given there, but this one feels fundamentally different than anything that anyone else has encountered before.
I think the only thing I would add is they're taking this day by day. It's going to feel like things are changing extremely rapidly every day. The best advice I can give, and I think this is happening at all levels of government so far, is, at least in Canada, is find out experts, seek their advice, synthesize it. Because this is unprecedented, there's no set of government experts or advisors that have went through this before in all its different incarnations and idiosyncrasies right now. And I think this is a real opportunity for people to weigh in. I guarantee some of these ideas are being, came from kind of, if you just follow econ Twitter here in Canada, there's a subset of well-intentioned, smart Canadians who are crowdsourcing ideas for how to respond to the crisis right now, and I think policymakers are listening to them, and I think that recognition that nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. Let's share and crowdsource and consult experts as much as possible. This was part of the motivation for Karim and I writing this op-ed, which was, here's some of our thinking on how to approach this. Is this a contribution that's helpful?
Kvemita and Sean, can we go past 5 o'clock? Does our internet pipe allow us to do that?
Ours does. I'm not sure. Sean, you can give a thumbs up if you're okay, and other folks are good to stay on if they'd like.
Okay, let's go through a bunch more questions then if we can.
So there's a question here. How does Canada's response about the economic stimulus compare to other jurisdictions like the US or European countries? And there was kind of a related question. A great breakdown of the 3 phases, but these are very domestic focused. The pandemic may impact our relationship with the US and other international trading partners. Maybe you want to give your thoughts on that as well. I confess I have been not following the other countries in the last couple of days, except from a health side. I've not followed the economic pledges, the positive ones. I'm aware of the negative ones. So I'm sorry, I'm just not briefed on that. Sean, do you have anything on those?
I haven't seen a comprehensive comparison. I think right now we're very much in the apples to oranges bucket. It's very hard to understand and predict what's going to come out of the process in the States that involves the Democratic speaker, the Republican leader of the Senate, and I'm not sure how to describe the President of the United States politely. What we're seeing, I think, is governments around the world ramping up to provide these types of responses. And you're definitely, I think, table stakes has got to be, 1% of GDP, and probably higher up into the 2 to 3% range. So I think that's something we could maybe get back and provide, and I'd be interested in looking at it as well.
There are a couple of international economic institutions that are going to be important in this to kind of follow. The G20 and the OECD in particular are going to be important venues for economic coordination in some cases. I think definitely in a future state. There's going to be there are going to be winners and losers in this, and there are going to be people who are going to be, and institutions that are going to do things that are in their economic interest but not in the public interest. And so there's going to be a lot of international coordination is going to be required on the economic side, as there is on the health side and the travel side.
Again, there are some questions that are related, so I'm going to group them together. So Adam Barnett from Prosper Canada is asking, existing programs like the Child Care Benefit, the GST credit won't reach many who don't file tax, and new changes don't address longer term cash flow disruption. What can government do to respond? Related, Jeremy Mullan is asking, is there or will there be some avenue for rapid relief for workers that may be paycheck to paycheck and can't wait until April or May for government relief?
Yeah.
And then another question just around, there are other, John Meadow is asking, there's some, he has some big questions on eligibility for income assistance. It's actually pretty narrow. Can the feds be pushed to expand to simple, can't work because of COVID?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, and I'll try to say a couple things about this. I don't think there's any great answers to this, except to say a few things. One, and again, we're focusing our conversation here on government. There's going to be a need for an unprecedented level of coordination between different levels of government and people who touch people in the economy in other ways. I was referring to my class in my class last week. Governments don't have a list of vulnerable people, and thank God they don't in some cases. And so to reach the different kinds of people, you really have to find, like, what are the entities we have to reach them. So the Canada Revenue Agency is a good one, but it doesn't touch everybody. In an earlier version of the op-ed, we had mentioned Canada Post and even Elections Canada as entities that have their own individual relationship with many Canadians, and are those places through which communications or services can be provided. That's an important consideration. It seems clear to us, at least in this initial phase, that they've chosen the early programs that are most available. The programs through which there's already an ability to flow money. It's really difficult to create new programs on the fly, and it's even difficult to cut checks on the fly. I think people have the sense that government can cut checks, and they're issued in a matter of days to everyone on its quote list, and unfortunately it doesn't quite work that way. And I'm not saying that the people asking those questions say it's working that way. I think they're just pointing out the delta, the difference between what we would like to do and what we're able to do. And again, I think it goes to other policy tools and other tools of other entities that are going to provide relief on the spending side. If we can get into an economy where utility bills, where there's waivers or arrangements with respect to utility bills, with respect to people's spending, and if you go through the major spending priorities of Canadians on the margins, it's shelter, food, connectivity, sometimes childcare, and those very core utility services. And you can go through those one by one and have approaches that deal with other entities, that deal with the telcos, that deal with banks, that deal with landlords, that deal with commercial real estate operators, that deal with utilities that are in some cases owned by government, and really have a comprehensive approach to really press pause on the spending expectations from vulnerable people to those people. Again, it's not perfect, but clearly John Schell thinks this is a good idea.
I mean, I think, these three questions reflect cracks in the existing system, right? I mean, and that's the challenge. We don't necessarily have it's tough to get to these people in normal times, or these populations, and so it becomes even tougher in these times, where speed and urgency is what matters. And so I echo Karim's comments about being creative, and finding different ways to get money to these individuals. This could also be a way where, an earlier question was roles of provinces. So, particularly for low income people, maybe not all of them have filed taxes, but maybe they're aware of or on social assistance or welfare rolls, or in some kind of accessing the infrastructure through community-based organizations,
including Prosper Canada,
including the role that we know that Prosper Canada plays. So if we can't get it through the big, blunt instruments that were announced today, then how do we get through them through other existing instruments, and how do we bring in allies and people who know how to get to these populations quickly? What matters here is speed, right? There's no point designing a perfect program that can ramp up and get money to people on September 1st. That would be self-defeating.
Yeah, there's a policy implication, or there's maybe a public implication to some of the things we've been talking about here, which is that, and this is maybe a political or a moral point, every institution is going to need to make a sacrifice. Any entity that expects its bottom line to be preserved in the same way, regardless of how it kind of participates in the private economy. And I don't think this is an ideological point. I'm a progressive. Sean and I both worked for liberal governments, but given what we think is coming and what we know is already happening, and what we might think be coming with the extent of this first phase of health system attention and a real dramatic amount of social distancing that's going to really freeze a lot of conventional economic activity, any institution is going to have to look really hard internally and figure out what role it's going to play in this, and how this might impact their own fundamentals in the short and even medium terms.
Okay, great. There's a question here from Kendall. It's different from ones that we've seen. Where is the participation from those in power, businesses like Costco or Walmart, in addition to those who have money like Jeff Bezos? How can we ask them to help?
So this is one area, again, if you consider this a national emergency or crisis on the level of, or an international one on the levels requires a wartime levels of coordination and participation, then there's a lot they can do. They have expertise. They have Amazon. Those companies know a lot more about supply chain management than the federal government, and so they have a responsibility, I think, to keep the essential systems going. If you look at this, one of the real more important questions to look at is, what are the key systems that we need right now, and how are those systems being maintained, and which ones are at risk? So the public health system obviously being a critical one. We have not had the food distribution system being a really critical one. We haven't had a conversation in this phone call yet about the education system, but there'll be needs that may not be as important on days 1, 2, or 3, but we're going to need some attention to that system in due course. And so as you look at the systems that are really under stress, what are the capacities that can be brought in, and how can those be marshaled and channeled in a warlike effort, frankly, to support what's required? There's expertise, there's ability to turn things around quickly. Premier Ford in his press conference today gave some really nice examples of companies that were changing what they were doing to support the effort. I think he mentioned Dillon's Gin switching to hand sanitizer production as an example of that. So we have these nice stories of entities that are doing that. The other thing I would mention, and something that's going to come up, is frankly a question of taxation, and what are these entities or these plutocrats, are they supporting this effort in other means? Because there's a big story here around social cohesion, and we need to preserve social cohesion in Canada and internationally. And the kinds of impacts that could come without some very dramatic interventions and some long-term income support are going to be things that even Jeff Bezos would not like, which is maybe why Jeff Bezos wants to fly to other planets. So things that there's going to be a lot of things that are going to need to be done to preserve social cohesion, and that involves potentially some calls on these well-resourced entities that need to be asked to do things, or that can preserve their social license, preserve their kind of general acceptance in the community by doing things that are helpful to the community.
I would just add that, you know, a common thread amongst the people in power, as the question was phrased, I mean, these are all large employers. I mean, they can make decisions whether they're going to keep people on salary for 3, 4, 5 months, or to lay off a whole bunch of people. Even if the latter option might make sense, you know, financially, leaders can have it in their discretion. They have choices, and so I would, you know, one simple thing I think they can do is to say, what percentage can you keep your labor force employed? Can you keep paying them as we get through this crisis? The larger the company, the more financially successful the company is, the more they have the ability to do that, and the more well, we should call on them and treat that as an expectation.
Okay.
Okay. There's a question for students on behalf of students. Beyond the deferrals on student loans, is there anything ahead that can be or will be done for students and post-secondary institutions more broadly?
So I think look to the provinces and potential provincial announcements on this one. I know it's a very stressful and difficult time for students, including students who are in some cases living in residences, and they're being asked to leave those residences. Students who are concerned about their semester, concerned about the value of their degree, and concerned about the income that they're already losing. So I hope that this is an area of concentration for other levels of government and for other institutions that are not government. And I am guessing that there will be some sort of provincial public policy on this. The provincial governments that have the main responsibility for post-secondary education will have to come up with. Sean, anything else on that?
2 things. These aren't student specific, but I think they are very relevant to students. First of all, file your taxes. The vast majority of students don't make a lot of money, and therefore you will certainly be eligible for this GST credit and potential bonus that's happening later this spring. And then secondly, look at the eligibility for the work interruption and benefit. Many students may not, may have a summer job lined up, and that may fall through on May 1st. There's a lot of people asking, what does it mean to hire a student if everyone's working from home? My expert read is you just have to self-attest that you're unemployed because of COVID, and you can get eligibility for some of these income support programs. So I would hope that students are eligible, and if not, I would push for clarity to make sure that is indeed the case.
Okay, more questions.
There's a question here. There haven't been any announcements to increase Ontario Works ODSP pittance. How is the stimulus package supporting those on social assistance?
Yeah, so again, this is an area for mainly provincial public policy, and I hope that there is some consideration there, and that's where the bill deferral pieces and the pieces that protect people who have to pay money for goods and services are really going to be important. But it's entirely correct that there was no specific provision in the federal package for that. I believe, Sean, that the Canada Child Benefit, again, if you file your taxes, you can benefit from that, and that's a progressive program, so that people on ODSP and Ontario Works would be beneficiaries of that, if I understand correctly.
Yes, I don't think they claw back anything.
Okay, next
There's a question here, because these are unprecedented times, what can grassroots community developers and builders do to even out these difficult times?
So I think there's an opportunity for the major civic institutions of society to start coming together and having conversations like this in the Greater Toronto area. I hope, and I some of them may even be on this call, that there are groups like the United Way, Civic Action, more grassroots organizations. The United Way is a good example because they have a funding relationship with many organizations. Even the Ontario Trillium Foundation. They're entities that reach more into places where there is need, and there's also entities that are thinking about not only the most vulnerable, but the now vulnerable, and that includes think tanks, academics, business leaders, and business institutions that are well connected to their communities. I mean, this goes to social cohesion, which Monty is referring to in the chat. If we have that, then it's time to call on that, to mobilize, to create Google documents and create plans for policy action, and also to create those means so that people of goodwill who want to volunteer and support and do other things can plug in and make support those efforts. Two that I'm aware of, and we can put these on the blog, are one is called Friendly Neighbor, which is an initiative of the University Health Network, and another one is called Good Neighbor, which has recently popped up, and we know that these are popping up at least in the Greater Toronto area, and it's important that we are aware of what those are, that they have that they're run by trusted organizations or organizations that have connectivity. So there's both a policy side and a kind of a service side, I would say, to that question, and I think there are ways to work collectively on both.
Just being conscious of the time, it's 5:11. Karim and Sean, do you want to provide some words to wrap up the discussion?
Yeah, can I just I see some, I just want to make a quick reference to some of the other questions, if you don't mind, Famita, first. So we didn't talk about artists and culture, and I saw that there was a question about that. Looks like they'll be able to support, there's support for individuals, not yet for organizations. Again, that's something to look to provincial governments to fill in. In general, I think it's really important to note that there are going to be organizations that are going to have needs beyond just the needs of their people. They live the same kind of, and not just business organizations, organizations that are dependent on philanthropy, dependent on foundations, dependent on revenues that they're not going to be able to make anymore. And so there is definitely a space for those organizations to be supported. And we're seeing the value of those organizations right now, and of those people who are providing free services to engage the people who are at home. Public policy people can come to a talk like this, or people who are interested in public issues and leadership can, and in the innovation economy can come to this kind of conversation. But there's other people who are going to be depending on other professionals and other people in our culture, and we are relying on them now. So that's just something to note. There's a question about agriculture, and again, word that the food supply chains are strong, but maybe some of the food input costs and the food input access might be challenged. So that's just something that's important to note. And how does this compare to other recessions and pandemics? I think we should just tackle that one. So in the 1918, this is uncharted territory because we have an economy that's so different, so services dependent, and this is truly global in a way that a few of these kinds of things have been before. Anything else, Sean? Sorry, I did a little roundup there.
No, I think you covered well. Do you want me to have some closing thoughts before you do your?
Yeah. Why don't you give some closing thoughts, and then I'll give mine.
Yeah. So, look, I think overall, today's package is a very important response. I think, although we've identified areas where it certainly needs to be improved, I think it will expand. I think it will evolve. I'm personally happy that the government of Canada is, from a macro perspective, taking the right approach. I think this is a package that is designed to support the incomes of individuals and businesses over these coming months. I think given what they've done in a couple of weeks, it's a pretty good response. It's impressive that they've been able to figure these things out. And I think the real challenge now is going to be, can we make it better? Can this community, can the many thousands of well-intentioned experts across the country, from all their perspectives, can we feed in and channel that expertise to help improve the government's response, and then can provinces and cities and other organizations, nonprofits, corporations, also figure out a way to plug in a complementary fashion. And just the number of questions that relate to those areas and how they may fit together just on this call alone makes me very optimistic that we have no lack of people willing to contribute with their ideas and their time and effort. So overall, although these are dark times, and it is a truly challenging crisis that we're facing here. I think Canada, relatively speaking, is in very good shape, and I'm glad we have the luxury of being able to kind of have these discussions and think about the future while other very important parts of Canada are battling on our behalf the health crisis.
Really well said, Sean. Just wanted to say thank you to all of you who participated in this with us today. We are going to be, the Ryerson Leadership Lab is actually offering through its Lab Talks event with, or series of events with authors and public figures on leadership. We're actually doing another one tomorrow. It's connected to our class, Making the Future, and it's with Ravi Jain, the artistic director of Why Not Theatre and the director of Brimful of Asha and other activities, other plays, and he'll be joining us for a conversation at 6:10 p.m. tomorrow. We'll send an invite to you for that around theater and potentially what theater can do at a time like this. Thanks to all of you for participating both on the Slido chat and on the Zoom chat. Thanks to Famita Kamali and Braylon Guppy from the Ryerson Leadership Lab and Coralie D'Souza from the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship for putting this all together on very short notice. We'll be posting the video of this soon. Thanks also to the Toronto Star and Andrew Phillips, editorial page editor there, for taking our op-ed. And expect to see more from the Ryerson Leadership Lab and I believe from the Brookfield Institute for as we really get into uncharted territory here. And we'll be posting the video, but we'll also be seeking a little bit of feedback from you on how we should run these. If we do them more in the future, what kind of guests we should have on through both of our networks, the Brookfield Institute and the Ryerson Leadership Lab. We have access to a number of people who are associated with our work that we want to connect in this unprecedented way, and perhaps not move from conversation to action. So thanks to all of you for participating, and we hope that you stay healthy and stay supportive of the people who are doing the hard work on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Famita, we should keep the chat channel open for a bit longer as people want to say whatever they want to say. I'm going to sign off here, and I think Sean will too, but if people want to just add some text on the chat channel, I think we should collect those comments as well.
Sounds good. I will keep it on until 5:30.
Thank you.